August 24th, 1814. Washington, D.C. A woman stands alone in the president's house, refusing to leave. Outside, the British Army is coming. The American military has fled. Her husband, the President of the United States, has escaped to Virginia. The servants are begging her to go, but Dolly Madison will not move until she saves one thing. On the wall of the state dining room hangs a portrait, 8 feet tall, George Washington in full military dress. The frame is screwed into the wall. There is no time to unscrew it. She orders the frame broken. Workers smash the wood. They cut the canvas free. The painting that represents the father of the nation will not burn with the building. She grabs documents, state papers, letters, whatever she can carry. Finally, she climbs into a carriage and flees into the night. Hours later, British soldiers walk through the front door. They find dinner still on the table, wine in the glasses, candles burning. The President of the United States had been expecting guests. The British officers sit down. They eat the meal. They drink the wine. They toast to the destruction of the American capital. Then they set the building on fire. The flames start in multiple rooms at once. Soldiers pile furniture. They add papers and curtains. The wood catches quickly. Within minutes, the interior is an inferno. The heat shatters windows. The ceiling collapses. The roof caves in. Fire shoots into the night sky, visible for 40 miles. The president's house, 8 years in the building, burns in a single night. But here is what the British did not expect. The stone walls survive. The sandstone blocks that workers had quarried and cut and hauled and stacked for nearly a decade, they do not burn. They stand blackened and cracked, but standing. And when the sun rises on August 25th, the shell of the building remains. America will rebuild. They will paint those scorched walls white to cover the burn marks, and the name will stick: the White House. This is the story they never tell you, not the presidents who lived here, not the decisions made in these rooms, the story of how this building came to exist at all, the political deal that put it in a swamp, the Irish immigrant who designed it, the workers who built it, some free, some enslaved, the fire that destroyed it, the defiance that brought it back. For over 200 years, the White House has been the most powerful address on earth. 46 presidents have lived within its walls, wars have been declared from its rooms, peace treaties signed at its tables. The building has witnessed triumph and tragedy, scandal and sacrifice. But before any of that, it was a construction site in a mosquito-infested swamp, and the people who built it, their names have been forgotten. Until now. The story begins not with presidents or politics. It begins with a deal. A bargain made over dinner that would change American history forever. The year was 1790. The United States was 2 years old. The Constitution had been ratified. George Washington was president. But the new nation had a problem. It had no home. Congress had been meeting in different cities since the Revolution: Philadelphia, New York, Princeton, Annapolis. Each location was temporary. Each created jealousies. Northern states wanted the capital in the north. Southern states wanted it in the south. The argument threatened to tear the young nation apart before it had truly begun. Alexander Hamilton needed something. He was Secretary of the Treasury, 35 years old, brilliant and ambitious. His financial plan would save the country. The federal government would assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War. This would establish American credit. It would bind the states together. It would create a nation, not just a collection of former colonies. But Southern congressmen blocked him. Virginia had paid its debts. So had Maryland. Why should they pay for Massachusetts and New York? The Assumption Bill failed again and again. Hamilton was desperate. Thomas Jefferson had just returned from France. He watched the deadlock with growing alarm. The government could not function. The country could not move forward. Something had to break. The dinner happened in June 1790, Jefferson's residence in New York. 3 men around a table: Hamilton, Jefferson, James Madison, the Virginian who led opposition to Hamilton's plan. The deal was simple. Hamilton would get his assumption bill. The Southern states would stop blocking it. In exchange, the permanent capital of the United States would be located in the South, not in a Southern city, a new city, built from nothing on the Potomac River. The Residence Act passed in July. President Washington was given authority to select the exact site, and everyone knew where he would choose. George Washington had surveyed the Potomac region as a young man. His plantation at Mount Vernon sat along its banks. He knew every bend in the river, every hill, every stretch of farmland. He selected a site between Georgetown, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia. The land was not ideal. Much of it was swamp. Summers were brutal. Mosquitoes bred in standing water. The river flooded unpredictably, but the location had one advantage that outweighed everything else. It was south, barely, just below the Mason-Dixon line. A compromised location that neither region could claim entirely. The federal district would be 10 miles square, carved from land that Maryland and Virginia would give to the federal government. A new city would rise, where almost nothing existed. And at the heart of that city, 2 buildings. A capitol for Congress, a house for the president. Pierre Charles L'Enfant got the job of designing the city. He was a French engineer who had served in the Continental Army. His vision was spectacular. Wide avenues radiating from central points like the spokes of a wheel. Grand public spaces, sight lines connecting important buildings. A city that would rival Paris or London. L'Enfant placed the president's house on a hill overlooking the Potomac. Elevated ground, good drainage, commanding views. Pennsylvania Avenue would connect it to the Capitol a mile away. The president would travel this route for inaugurations, for addresses to Congress. The avenue would become the ceremonial heart of the nation. But L'Enfant was difficult. He quarreled with the commissioners overseeing development. He demolished a house that sat in the way of his plans without asking permission. He refused to share his drawings. By 1792, he was fired. His vision survived. His involvement did not. The commissioners announced a competition, Design the President's House. The winner would receive $500 or a medal of equivalent value. Architects across the young nation submitted plans. Thomas Jefferson entered anonymously. He loved architecture. He had strong opinions about what buildings should mean. His design featured a dome, inspired by ancient Rome. Republican simplicity, he called it. A building that would connect the American presidency to the Roman Republic. His submission was rejected. Too modest, perhaps. Or too obviously copied from European models. Jefferson would influence American architecture for decades, but he would not design the president's house. Other submissions were rejected too. Some were too grand. They looked like royal palaces. America had just fought a war to escape monarchy. The president's home could not look like a king's. Others were too plain. The building needed dignity. It needed presence. It needed to represent a nation. The winner was James Hoban, an Irish immigrant working in Charleston, South Carolina. His design struck the balance the commissioners wanted. Substantial, but not overwhelming. Classical, but not monarchical. A building that said something about what America wanted to be. James Hoban was born in Ireland around 1758. He learned his trade in Dublin, where Georgian architecture was transforming the city. Symmetry, proportion, restraint. Buildings that achieved grandeur through balance, not decoration. He absorbed these principles. They would define his work. He came to America after the Revolutionary War, Philadelphia first, then Charleston. He built houses for wealthy clients. He established a reputation. When the competition was announced, he was in Philadelphia on business. He entered. He won. His design drew inspiration from Leinster House in Dublin, the residence of the Duke of Leinster, built in the 1740s. Holbein did not copy it exactly, he adapted it. Made it American, made it Republican, but the bones were Irish. The proportions, the facade, the restrained elegance. President Washington approved the selection. He had opinions about everything related to the new Capitol. He wanted the building larger than Holbein's original proposal. Holbein modified his plans. The house would be grander than initially conceived, more expensive, more time-consuming to build. But Washington understood something. This building would represent the nation. It needed to impress. October 13th, 1792. The cornerstone was laid. A modest ceremony. Washington was there. Commissioners, local officials. The date was chosen deliberately. The anniversary of Columbus reaching the Americas. The new building would connect to themes of discovery and foundation. The cornerstone was placed somewhere in the foundation. Its exact location has been lost. Later attempts to find it during renovations have failed. The first stone of the president's house, and no one knows where it is. Construction began, and here is where the story becomes complicated. Here is where the truth that no one wanted to discuss for 200 years finally comes into light. The workers who built the president's house were not all free. Some were skilled craftsmen from Europe, Scottish stone cutters who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship, Irish workers who followed Holbein from his homeland. They earned wages. They could leave if they chose. They were building a new life in a new nation. But there were not enough of them. The federal district was undeveloped. Housing was scarce. Amenities did not exist. Skilled workers preferred established cities where jobs were plentiful and life was comfortable. The commissioners faced a labor shortage from the very beginning, so they turned to the system that defined the region. Maryland and Virginia were slave states. Slavery was legal. Slavery was everywhere, and slave owners had workers available for hire. The arrangement was simple. The federal government paid slave owners for their workers' time. The owners received daily or weekly rates. The enslaved workers received nothing. They labored on the president's house because they had no choice. Their work enriched their owners while they remained in bondage. The records survive. Payment ledgers at the National Archives. They list the owners by name. They specify how many workers were provided and for how many days. What they do not list, in most cases, are the names of the enslaved workers themselves. They were property. They were inventory. Their individual identities were not considered worth recording. Some names have been recovered. Historians have spent years cross-referencing documents, searching for any mention of the actual workers. A first name here, a reference there. Slowly, painfully, some identities have emerged from the records, but most remain anonymous. They quarried stone. They hauled materials. They mixed mortar. They did the backbreaking work that raised the walls of the president's house, and history forgot them. The stone came from quarries at Aquia Creek in Virginia, 40 miles from the building site. Sandstone. Relatively soft and easy to carve. A warm tan color that would characterize the building until it was painted white. Workers at the quarry identified fracture lines in the rock. They drove wedges into cracks. They split blocks without shattering them. The work was skilled and dangerous. Stones could shift, tools could slip. The quarry was a hazardous place. The blocks were rough when extracted. Workers at the quarry did initial shaping. They removed excess material to reduce weight for transport. The stone still had to travel 40 miles. By water first, barges carried the blocks along waterways to the Potomac, then to wharves near the building site. Water transport was cheaper and easier than overland hauling, but loading and unloading the heavy blocks required care. Damage meant wasted work, wasted time, wasted money. From the wharves, wagons carried the stone to the construction site. Teams of horses or oxen pulled the loads. The roads were terrible, unpaved, muddy in wet weather, rutted in dry. Moving heavy stone blocks over such roads was slow and difficult. At the building site, stone cutters finished the blocks. This was precision work. The facade stones needed smooth surfaces and exact dimensions. They had to fit together tightly. The men who did this work had trained for years. Some were free craftsmen, some were enslaved workers who had learned the trade in bondage. The distinction mattered legally. It mattered morally. It did not matter to the stone. Free hands and enslaved hands shaped the same blocks, built the same walls, created the same building. The walls rose slowly. 1793, 1794, 1795. Progress measured in feet and inches. Scaffolding went up as the walls grew higher. Workers balanced on wooden platforms, hoisting stone blocks with rope and pulley systems. The equipment was simple. The work was dangerous. By 1796, the exterior walls were taking recognizable shape. By 1797, they were essentially complete. But completing the walls was only part of the job. The roof had to go on. Interior framing had to be built. Rooms had to be plastered and finished. The building was far from ready. The deadline was 1800. The government had committed to moving to the new capital that year. Ready or not, the president would need somewhere to live. The Potomac River in 1790 was nothing like what it would become. Wild, uncontrolled, prone to flooding. The banks were marshy in places, solid in others. Farms lined the Virginia side. Georgetown sat on the Maryland bank, a small port town doing modest business. George Washington knew this river. He had known it since childhood. Mount Vernon, his plantation, sat on its banks about 15 miles downstream from where the new capital would rise. He had traveled this water countless times. He understood its moods. When Congress gave him authority to select the capital site, Washington already knew where he would choose. The location made political sense. Between north and south, accessible by water, central to the states that made up the Union. But Washington's connection was personal too. This was his country, his landscape. The capital would rise, where he had always belonged. The land itself had to be acquired. Maryland and Virginia would cede territory to create the federal district. Landowners within that territory had to be negotiated with. Some sold willingly, others held out for better prices. The process took months. Pierre L'Enfant arrived to design the city in 1791. He was 36 years old, French-born, ambitious, difficult. He had fought in the Revolution. He had designed buildings in New York. He had grand visions. L'Enfant spent weeks walking the territory. He climbed every hill. He followed every stream. He stood where the president's house would rise and looked out over the river. He saw not what was there, but what could be. His plan was spectacular. Avenues radiating like spokes from central points, public squares at important intersections, a grand mall connecting the capital to the president's house, a city that would rival any in Europe. The scale was audacious. The land was mostly farms and forest. L'Enfant saw palaces and monuments. He drew a city for a nation that barely existed yet. His vision assumed America would become something great. That assumption would prove correct. But L'Enfant could not work with others. He quarreled with the commissioners. He ignored their instructions. He demolished a house that interfered with his plans without asking anyone's permission. By 1792, he was gone. His plan survived. Other men would execute it. Other architects would design the buildings he had positioned on his map, but the basic vision remained L'Enfant's. The city that exists today follows lines he drew over 200 years ago. The competition for the president's house drew entries from across the nation. Some were ambitious, some were modest, some were wildly impractical. The commissioners reviewed them all. Thomas Jefferson's anonymous entry reflected his architectural philosophy. He believed buildings should mean something. A republic needed republican architecture. His design drew on classical Rome, connecting American democracy to ancient precedent. But Jefferson's proposal lacked something, presence perhaps, or grandeur. The commissioners wanted a building that would impress. Jefferson had designed one that would educate. They were not the same thing. Other entries went too far. Massive structures that looked like royal palaces. America had just fought a war to escape monarchy. The president's home could not look like a king's residence. Balance was essential. James Hoban found that balance. His design was impressive without being imperial, classical without being derivative, a building that announced importance without claiming too much. Hoban's background prepared him perfectly for this challenge. Dublin in the 18th century was a city of Georgian architecture, symmetry, proportion, restraint, buildings that achieved dignity through balance rather than decoration. Hoban had absorbed these principles. They shaped everything he designed. His proposal won because it gave the commissioners what they needed. A building that would represent a new nation, that would grow with that nation, that would last. Washington wanted it larger. The president had opinions about everything related to the new capital. He had spent his life building things. Mount Vernon had grown under his direction for decades. He understood what buildings meant. Hoban modified his plans. The president's house would be grander than originally conceived, more expensive, more time-consuming. But Washington was right. The building needed scale. It needed presence. It needed to matter. The cornerstone ceremony in October 1792 was modest. No great celebration, no massive crowds, just officials gathered to mark the beginning. The stone was placed somewhere in the foundation, its exact location lost even before the building was finished. Construction proceeded slowly through the following years. The challenges were constant: finding workers, transporting materials, coordinating trades, managing money that always seemed insufficient. The enslaved workers who labored on the president's house came from different backgrounds. Some had been born into slavery. They had known nothing else. The plantation was their world. The owner's will was their law. When the owner contracted their labor to the federal government, they went where they were told. Some had been sold away from families. The domestic slave trade moved people like merchandise. Husbands separated from wives, parents from children. The person working on the president's house might have been sold 3 times, 4 times, moved across states and away from everyone they knew. Some possessed skills that made them valuable. A carpenter could shape wood with precision. A mason could lay stone correctly. These skills had been learned, often from enslaved masters passing knowledge to enslaved apprentices. The skills increased their market value while they remained property. The work was the same regardless of background: dig, haul, lift, stack. The president's house rose through physical labor, bodies bent and muscles strained, free bodies and enslaved bodies all contributing to the same walls. The records at the National Archives tell part of the story: payment ledgers, contracts with slave owners. So many workers for so many days at such a rate. The payments went to the owners. The workers received nothing. Some owners sent enslaved workers regularly. They became repeat contractors, profiting from their property's labor on federal construction. The system was business. The commodity was human beings. The working day lasted from dawn to dusk. In summer, that meant long hours under brutal sun. In winter, shorter days but cold that made some tasks difficult. Year-round, the work continued. Injuries happened. Stone was heavy. Tools were sharp. Scaffolding was primitive. Men fell. Men were crushed. Men were cut. Medical care was minimal. Work resumed as soon as possible. Death happened too. Records are incomplete, but construction sites took lives. Whether those who died on the President's House construction were buried in marked graves or unmarked ones, whether their names were recorded or forgotten, the work continued without them. By 1797, the walls were substantially complete. The building's form was established, but so much work remained: roof, interior, finishing. The deadline of 1800 pressed constantly. When John Adams finally moved in, the building was barely functional. When Thomas Jefferson improved it, the building became more livable. When James Madison and Dolly entertained there, the building finally achieved its purpose. Then it burned. And when it was rebuilt, when the white paint covered the scars, when the name emerged and stuck, the building became something more than it had been. A symbol, an icon, the White House. The 20th century brought challenges no one could have anticipated. 2 world wars directed from its rooms. The Cold War managed from its offices. Nuclear weapons authorized by presidents sitting in this building. The weight of global power pressed down on everyone who worked there. The building adapted: new wings, new systems, new security. The White House of Hoover was different from the White House of Roosevelt. The White House of Kennedy was different from the White House of Nixon. Each president found a building shaped by predecessors and reshaped it for their own needs. Technology transformed everything. Telephones became essential. Radio enabled presidents to speak directly to the nation. Television made the White House a visual symbol broadcast into every home. The internet connected the building to the world in ways impossible to imagine even decades earlier. Security increased with each crisis. The building that Jefferson had opened to ordinary citizens became a fortress: fences, guards, checkpoints, surveillance. The White House is protected now in ways that would astonish those who built it. But visitors still come, over 1 million in normal years. They walk through rooms where history happened. They see the spaces where presidents worked and lived. They stand where enslaved workers and free workers built walls that still surround them. The acknowledgement of who built the White House has grown in recent decades. Historians uncovered records. They cross-referenced documents. They searched for names that had been ignored for 2 centuries. Some names emerged. Most remained lost, but the effort continues. Educational materials now mention enslaved workers. Tours acknowledge their contribution. Markers note their labor. The history that was incomplete is becoming more complete. The contradiction at the heart of the building remains: a symbol of freedom built partly by the unfree, a home for democratic leaders constructed with enslaved labor. The tension cannot be resolved. It can only be acknowledged. The White House will continue standing. The walls built in the 1790s. The walls that survived fire. The walls that have witnessed everything America has been through. They will witness what comes next. They will contain the history that has not yet been written. They will stand as they have stood for over 200 years, built by hands whose names we are still learning. Free hands and enslaved hands, shaping the same stones, building the same walls, creating something that would outlast them all. This is the untold story of the White House, the story of how it was built, the story of who built it, the story finally being told. The construction site in 1793 looked nothing like what it would become: mud. Everywhere mud. The ground had been cleared, but not improved. Tree stumps dotted the landscape. Piles of lumber sat in stacks waiting to be used. Stone blocks lay in rows, each one waiting its turn to be lifted into place. Workers arrived at dawn. They left at dusk. In between, they did the hard work of building something from nothing. The stone cutters had the most skilled job. They took the rough blocks that arrived from Aquia Creek and transformed them into precise building materials. Each stone, needed smooth surfaces on the visible faces, exact dimensions to fit its specific location. The work required years of training. Most of the skilled stone cutters were Scottish. They had learned their trade through formal apprenticeship in Edinburgh or Glasgow. 7 years of training before they could call themselves masters. They brought those skills across the Atlantic, seeking opportunity in the new nation. They earned good wages. A skilled stone cutter could make twice what a common laborer earned. They could leave if they found better work elsewhere. They were free men building a free nation. But beside them worked others who had no such freedom. The enslaved workers came from nearby plantations, Maryland farms, Virginia estates. Their owners contracted with the federal government. So many workers for so many days at such a rate. The money went to the owners. The workers got nothing. Some of the enslaved workers were unskilled. They dug trenches for foundations. They hauled materials from the wharves. They mixed mortar in large wooden boxes, combining lime and sand and water into the paste that would bind the stones together. The work was exhausting. The pay was non-existent, but some enslaved workers were highly skilled. Carpenters who could frame a room as well as any free craftsman, masons who understood how to lay stone properly, blacksmiths who forged the iron fittings the building required. These skills made them valuable property. An enslaved carpenter might be worth twice as much as an unskilled field worker. Their owners profited from their abilities while they remained in chains. The irony was everywhere. A building meant to house the leader of a free nation, constructed in part by people who were not free. A symbol of democracy being raised by workers who had no voice in that democracy. The contradiction was visible to anyone who cared to look. Most chose not to look. The foundation took months. Trenches were dug deep into the earth. Stone was laid at the bottom, course after course, building a base that would support the massive walls above. The foundation work was not glamorous. No one would ever see it. But if it failed, everything above would fail too. Hoban supervised constantly. He walked the site every day. He checked the work. He corrected mistakes. He demanded precision even in the parts no one would see. The building had to be right. It had to last. The walls rose slowly, one course of stone at a time. Each block positioned, each joint mortared. The masons worked methodically. Rushing led to mistakes. Mistakes led to problems. Problems led to failure. By the end of 1793, the foundation was largely complete. Walls were beginning to rise above ground level. The footprint of the building was visible. Visitors could see the scale of what was being attempted. By 1794, the walls were taking shape, several feet high in places, the rectangular form becoming clear. The window openings marked out, the building emerging from the mud. The work continued through seasons. Summer heat along the Potomac was brutal. The air was thick with humidity. Workers sweated through their clothes by mid-morning. Mosquitoes bred in standing water. Fevers swept through the workforce periodically. Some men died. Others recovered and returned to work. Winter brought different challenges. Cold made some tasks difficult. Mortar could freeze before setting properly. Rain turned the site into a swamp within a swamp. Work slowed but did not stop. Through it all, free workers and enslaved workers labored side by side. They used the same tools. They followed the same plans. They built the same walls. The distinction between them was legal, not technical. One group would go home at night to families and homes of their choosing. The other group would return to quarters they did not choose, on plantations they could not leave. The system was accepted, normal, unremarkable, to those who lived within it. The founding generation, the men who wrote about liberty and equality, saw no contradiction in using enslaved labor to build their institutions. Or if they saw it, they chose not to acknowledge it. George Washington himself enslaved more than 300 people. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, enslaved over 600 during his lifetime. The nation was built on contradiction from the beginning. The President's House was simply one more example. By 1795, the walls reached their full height in some sections. The building's form was unmistakable. Anyone could see what it would become: a mansion, a palace, the home of the American president. But there was still so much work to do. The roof went up in sections. The structure was complicated. Hoban's design called for a relatively flat roof, hidden behind a balustrade. The construction required careful engineering. The roof had to shed water. It had to bear the weight of snow. It had to last decades without major repair. Slate tiles covered the finished roof. Thousands of individual pieces, each one cut and fitted by hand. The work was dangerous. Men balanced on steep surfaces high above the ground. Falls happened. Injuries happened. But the work continued. Interior framing proceeded as the exterior neared completion. Wooden beams divided the space into rooms. Floors were built. Ceilings were constructed. The massive empty shell became a building with individual spaces. Carpenters did this work. Free carpenters who had learned their trade in workshops in Boston or Philadelphia. Enslaved carpenters who had learned from masters who owned them. They worked with the same tools, saws and hammers and planes. They shaped wood with the same techniques. The building did not care about the legal status of the hands that built it. Plastering came after framing. Wet plaster applied to wooden lath, smoothed and shaped, left to dry, then more coats. The process was slow. The results had to be perfect, especially in the public rooms. The principal rooms received elaborate treatment, decorative moldings, ceiling medallions, the kind of detail that announced wealth and status. Skilled plasterers spent months on a single room, creating the features that would impress visitors. The deadline of 1800 drove everything. The government was committed to moving to the new capital that year. The President's House had to be ready, or at least ready enough. By 1799, it was becoming clear that ready enough was the best they could hope for. The exterior was complete, the roof was on, but the interior remained unfinished in many areas. Time and money were running out. George Washington died in December 1799. He never saw the completed building. The man who had selected the site, approved the design, pushed for a larger structure, died before a president lived there. His vision was realized only after he was gone. John Adams would be first, the president who inherited a half-finished house in a half-built city. The man who would pray that heaven bless all who lived there after him. The workers who built the President's House left no prayers. Most left no names. They finished their work and moved on. Some to other construction projects, some back to the plantations they had never truly left, some to lives of freedom they had earned, some to bondage they could not escape. The building remained, their labor made permanent in stone, the walls they raised still standing, the rooms they framed, rebuilt, but occupying the same spaces. The work they did, lasting centuries longer than any of their lives. The question of what the President's House meant was one thing. The question of how it was built was another. For 200 years, people focused on the first question. Now, finally, they are beginning to ask the second. Who actually built the White House? The Scottish stone cutters whose names appear in some records, the Irish workers who followed Hoban from their homeland, the free laborers who earned wages and went home at night. They built it. The enslaved carpenters whose skills enriched their owners, the enslaved laborers who hauled and dug and mixed and lifted, the enslaved people whose names were rarely recorded, who worked without pay, who had no choice in anything. They built it too, all of them, together, on the same site, using the same materials, creating the same building. The White House is not one story, it is many stories. The story of presidents and politics, the story of fire and reconstruction, the story of technology and change, and the story of the people who built it. All of them. That story is only now being fully told. The British sailors who rowed ashore on August 19, 1814, had been at sea for weeks. They were part of a massive expeditionary force. Ships carrying 4,000 soldiers, transports loaded with supplies, warships providing protection. The fleet had sailed from Bermuda, heading for the American coast. Their commander was Major General Robert Ross, a veteran of the Peninsular War against Napoleon. He had fought across Spain and Portugal. He knew how to lead men in combat. He knew how to take objectives. Their target was Washington, the American capital, the symbolic heart of the nation they were fighting. The War of 1812 had been going on for 2 years. Neither side had achieved decisive victory. The American invasions of Canada had failed. The British blockade had hurt American commerce. Battles had been won and lost. But nothing had been settled. Napoleon's defeat in Europe changed everything. Britain could now redirect resources to America. The army that had beaten the greatest general in the world could be sent across the Atlantic. The Americans were about to face a very different enemy. Ross landed his troops at Benedict, Maryland, on the Patuxent River. From there, they would march overland to Washington, 50 miles through Maryland countryside. The Americans knew they were coming. General William Winder commanded the defense of Washington. He had weeks to prepare. He called up militia from 3 states. He gathered whatever regular army units were available. But Winder was not a good general. He had been captured earlier in the war and exchanged. His appointment to command Washington owed more to political connections than military ability. He dithered. He changed plans constantly. He could not decide where to make a stand. The British marched through Maryland farmland, past curious onlookers who watched a European army walk through their fields. The soldiers were disciplined. They paid for food they took. They did not pillage. They were professionals. August 24th, the day everything changed. The American forces gathered at Bladensburg, a town on the road to Washington. This would be where they stopped the British, or tried to. President Madison rode out to observe. Secretaries of State and War accompanied him. The commander-in-chief would watch his army defend the capital. The American position was reasonable. A creek provided some obstacle. Artillery was placed on high ground. Infantry lined up in multiple formations. On paper, it looked like a defense. The battle began around noon. British forces advanced. American artillery opened fire. For a few minutes, it seemed like the defense might hold. Then, the rockets came. Congreve rockets. British weapons that screamed through the air, trailing fire and smoke. They were not accurate. They rarely hit anything they were aimed at, but they were terrifying. The sound, the flame, the unpredictability. The militia had never seen such weapons. They had never faced professional soldiers. They watched rockets explode overhead and decided they wanted no part of this battle. They ran. First one unit, then another. The American lines collapsed. Militia threw down their weapons and fled. Officers could not rally them. The panic spread. Regular Army units held longer. Commodore Joshua Barney and his sailors fought a defensive action that delayed the British advance. Barney was wounded. His men were surrounded. They fought until they could fight no more. But they were too few. The Battle of Bladensburg was over in less than 3 hours. The British had won. The road to Washington was open. Madison fled with the retreating army. The President of the United States running from invaders. The cabinet scattered. Government officials grabbed what documents they could and ran. The British rested briefly after the battle. Then they marched into Washington. They entered the city in the evening. The streets were largely empty. Most residents had fled. A few watched from windows or doorways. The enemy was walking through the American Capitol. Ross and his officers went to the president's house first, the symbol of American executive power. They would destroy it. What they found when they arrived became legend. The table was set. Dinner for 40 guests. The Madisons had been expecting company. The food was prepared. The wine was chilled. Candles illuminated the rooms. Dolly Madison had left hours earlier. She had stayed as long as she could. She had saved Washington's portrait. She had gathered documents and silver. Then she had fled with the British almost at the gates. The British officers took advantage of her hospitality. They sat at the president's table. They ate the president's food. They drank the president's wine. Admiral Cockburn reportedly took a seat cushion as a souvenir. He wanted something to remind him of the time he ate dinner in the American president's house. Then they burned it. The process was methodical. Soldiers gathered furniture into piles. They added papers and fabrics. They wanted fires that would burn thoroughly. This was not random destruction. This was deliberate demolition. They used poles with combustible material at the ends. They could start fires in upper rooms without climbing stairs. The flames caught quickly. The wooden interior was fuel waiting for a spark. Within minutes, the president's house was an inferno. The fire roared through the building. Flames shot from windows. The heat was intense. Glass shattered. Wooden beams crashed down. The ceiling collapsed into the rooms below. Outside, the glow lit up the night sky. Washington was burning. The Capitol, the Treasury, the War Department, the Navy Yard. The British were systematic. Every government building they could reach was put to the torch. The burning continued into the night. Soldiers moved from building to building. Fire followed everywhere they went. The American Capitol was being destroyed. But the storms came. Late on August 25th, weather moved through the area. Heavy rain, strong winds. Some accounts describe a tornado touching down, scattering British forces and causing additional damage. The rain helped extinguish fires. Buildings that might have burned completely were soaked by the downpour. The weather that made Washington miserable most summers now saved it from total destruction. The British withdrew that same day. They had achieved their objective. The American Capitol was in ruins. They could not hold the city indefinitely. American forces were gathering. It was time to leave. They marched back to their ships. They sailed away. They would attack Baltimore next. But that battle would go differently. Fort McHenry would hold. A lawyer watching the bombardment would write a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner. Behind them, they left devastation. The president's house stood as a burned shell, blackened walls surrounding empty air. The building that had taken 8 years to construct was destroyed in a single night. But not entirely. The walls stood. The sandstone walls that workers had raised stone by stone, the walls that enslaved people and free people had built together. They were damaged, smoke-stained, cracked from heat, but standing. And because they stood, rebuilding was possible. Hoban could return. The work could begin again. The president's house, lost to fire, could rise from its ashes. The white paint would come. The name would follow. The White House would emerge from destruction. But first, someone had to decide to rebuild. Someone had to choose defiance over retreat. Someone had to say that the British would not win even in destruction. That decision was not inevitable. That decision was a choice. And that choice would shape American history. November 1st, 1800. John Adams climbed out of his carriage and looked at the president's house for the first time. He was 65 years old. He had just lost the election to Thomas Jefferson. He had 3 months left as president. And this was his new home. The building was not finished. Only 6 rooms were habitable. The East Room, designed to be the grandest space in the house, was an empty shell. No plaster on the walls, no floor covering, nothing. Other rooms lacked furniture, lacked fireplaces that worked, lacked basic necessities. The grounds were worse. Piles of construction debris, mud everywhere. No landscaping, no fences. Cows from neighboring farms wandered across what would someday be the White House lawn. The city itself barely existed. Pennsylvania Avenue was a muddy track through wilderness. Georgetown was a mile away. The Capitol stood unfinished on its hill. Between the two buildings, almost nothing. Scattered houses, boarding houses for government workers, a few taverns. This was the capital of the United States. Adams walked through the front door. The entrance hall was impressive. Grand staircase rising to the upper floors. High ceilings, classical proportions. Hoban's design was beautiful. The execution was incomplete. He found a room with a working fireplace. He sat down and wrote a letter to his wife Abigail. The words would become famous. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. The prayer would be carved into the mantel of the state dining room more than a century later. But on that November night, Adams was simply a tired old man in a cold, unfinished house, hoping that something good would come from all this effort. Abigail arrived 2 weeks later. Her letters describe what she found. The house was damp. Moisture seeped through the walls. The massive rooms were impossible to heat. Fireplaces blazed constantly but could not warm the spaces. They burned through cords of wood. Still, the cold crept in. There were no bells to summon servants. The speaking tubes and pull systems that would eventually connect every room to the service areas had not been installed. If Abigail needed something, she had to go find someone to ask. The main staircase was not complete. She had to use a temporary back staircase to reach the upper floors. The grand entrance that Hoban had designed was not functional. And then there was the laundry. The house had no proper drying yard. Abigail needed somewhere to hang wet clothes. She chose the East Room. That enormous unfinished space, designed for state receptions and formal entertainments, became the First Lady's laundry room. She hung the president's shirts where dignitaries would someday dance. Adams lived in the president's house for 4 months. Just 4 months. Then Jefferson won the election, and Adams left. He departed early, before dawn on Inauguration Day. He did not attend the ceremony. He rode out of Washington as his successor prepared to take the oath. Thomas Jefferson moved in on March 4, 1801. He would stay for 8 years, and he would transform the building. Jefferson was different from Adams in almost every way. Adams was formal, stiff, uncomfortable with democracy's messier elements. Jefferson cultivated an image of Republican simplicity. He answered his own door. He received guests in worn slippers. He eliminated the weekly levees, the formal receptions where the president stood on a platform like a monarch receiving subjects. The house itself, Jefferson found acceptable, but flawed. Too grand in some ways, too unfinished in others. He set about making it work. The terraces came first, covered walkways extending from the house to smaller service buildings on either side. The terraces served practical purposes: storage, workspace, protection from weather when moving between buildings. But they also improved the house's appearance, softening the transition from building to landscape. Jefferson brought technology, indoor plumbing such as it was in 1801, water closets that improved on the outdoor privies everyone else was using. The improvements were modest by modern standards. They were revolutionary for their time. He improved the grounds, gardens were planted, fences were built. The construction debris was finally cleared. The president's house began to look like a residence rather than a work site. Jefferson also opened the building. He believed the president's house belonged to the people. He allowed visitors in ways his predecessors had not. Common citizens could walk through the public rooms. They could see where their president lived. This democratic impulse would define the building's character for generations. But Jefferson's 8 years could not solve the fundamental problems. The house was too big, too expensive to heat, too difficult to maintain. The federal government had limited resources. The building consumed more than its share. When Jefferson left in 1809, he passed these problems to James Madison. Madison was a small man with a quiet voice. He had helped write the Constitution. He had shaped American government more than almost anyone alive. But he was not equipped for the presidency, and he was definitely not equipped for what was coming. His wife Dolly was another matter. Dolly Madison understood something about power that her husband did not. The president's house was not just a residence, it was a stage. What happened within its walls could shape politics as surely as any congressional vote. She transformed the building's social life, elaborate entertainments, political gatherings that brought opponents together, Wednesday evening receptions that became the center of Washington society. If you mattered in the Capitol, you came to Dolly Madison's parties. She furnished the house properly for the first time. Real furniture, real decorations. The hodgepodge of borrowed and makeshift pieces that previous administrations had used gave way to coordinated design. The president's house began to look presidential. The Oval Room became her particular triumph. She painted it sunflower yellow. She hung red velvet curtains. She filled it with elegant furniture and hosted her receptions there. Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington hung on the wall, watching over everything. For 3 years, the Madison White House was the most glamorous place in America. Dolly held court. Politicians competed for invitations. Foreign diplomats reported back to their governments about the sophistication they found. Then the British came. The War of 1812 had been going badly from the start. The American invasions of Canada had failed. The British Navy blockaded American ports. The conflict dragged on without clear victory for either side. But in August 1814, everything changed. Napoleon had been defeated in Europe. Britain could now send experienced troops to America, and they chose a target that would send a message: Washington itself. The British landed at Benedict, Maryland on August 19th. 4,000 soldiers. Veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, some of the finest infantry in the world, they began marching toward the American capital. Madison called up the militia. Men from Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia gathered at Bladensburg, 5 miles from Washington. They were farmers and merchants, shopkeepers and clerks. Most had never fired a weapon in combat. They faced professional soldiers who had fought across Europe. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. The American lines broke almost immediately. Militia fled before making contact with the enemy. Regular army units held longer, but could not stop the advance. The British pushed through everything in their path. Madison had ridden to Bladensburg to observe the battle. He nearly became the first American president captured by a foreign army. As the lines collapsed, he fled with the retreating troops. He crossed the Potomac into Virginia. He would not return to Washington for days. But Dolly stayed. She stayed at the president's house as reports came in. The battle was lost. The British were coming. Everyone was leaving. The servants, the guards, the government officials. Everyone told her to go. She would not leave without the portrait. Washington's portrait had hung in the state dining room since Jefferson's time, 8 feet tall. The father of the nation in military dress. The painting represented something beyond decoration. It represented the nation itself. The frame was screwed into the wall. There was no time to unscrew it properly. Dolly ordered the frame broken. Workers smashed the wood with axes. They cut the canvas free and rolled it up. She gathered what else she could. State papers. The Declaration of Independence, some accounts say, though this is disputed. Silver, documents, whatever hands could carry. She stuffed papers into her bag. She loaded the carriage. Finally, when she could wait no longer, she left. The British were entering the city. She fled toward Virginia, toward her husband, toward safety. She looked back as the carriage rolled away. The president's house stood white and elegant in the summer sun. She would never see it that way again. The British arrived at the president's house around 8 in the evening. They found the building abandoned, but prepared for occupation. The dining room table was set for 40 guests. Madison had been expecting company that night, a dinner party, political friends. The meal was prepared. The wine was ready. Candles burned in the chandeliers. Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross led their officers inside. They were professional soldiers, not barbarians. They did not loot. They did not pillage. They sat down at the president's table. The British officers ate the American president's dinner. They drank his wine. They toasted the Prince Regent. They toasted the destruction of Washington. They were conquerors, enjoying their victory. Then they got to work. Soldiers gathered furniture into piles. They added curtains and papers. They broke up wooden items for kindling. They wanted a fire that would burn thoroughly. The flames started in multiple rooms simultaneously. The wooden interior caught immediately. Fire raced through the building. The heat grew intense. Windows exploded from thermal stress. The ceiling began to collapse. Outside, Washington glowed. The president's house was not the only target. The Capitol burned that same night. The Treasury, the War Department, every government building the British could reach. They were making a point. The fire in the president's house burned through the night. The roof collapsed. The floors fell in. Everything combustible was consumed. But the walls stood. The Aquia Creek sandstone that workers had hauled 40 miles and lifted into place, that enslaved workers and free workers had cut and stacked, stone by stone, year after year, the walls survived, blackened with smoke, cracked from heat, but standing. A thunderstorm arrived on August 25th. Heavy rain fell on the burning city. The rain helped extinguish fires still smoldering. Some accounts describe a tornado touching down, causing additional damage but hastening British withdrawal. The weather turned against the invaders. The British left Washington that day. They had achieved their objective. The American capital was in ruins, but they could not hold the city. American forces were gathering. They withdrew to their ships and sailed away. What they left behind was devastation. The president's house stood as a burned shell. Roof gone. Interior gone. Just blackened walls against the sky. Madison returned days later. The President of the United States stood before the ruins of his home. The question facing him, facing the nation, was simple. What now? Some wanted to give up. Move the capital to Philadelphia. The buildings there still stood. The infrastructure existed. Why rebuild in a swamp that had just proved indefensible? Why throw more money into a city that the enemy had burned with such ease? The arguments for leaving made practical sense. The arguments for staying were emotional, symbolic. Moving would mean the British had won. Not just the battle, the war of meaning. They had set out to humiliate America. Moving the capital would complete that humiliation. Congress voted to stay. The decision was not unanimous. It was not easy, but it was made. Washington would remain the capital. The burned buildings would be rebuilt. The president's house would rise again from its ashes. They sent for James Hoban. The Irish architect had remained in Washington after completing the original construction. He had built other structures. He had established himself in the city he had helped create. Now they needed him again. His building had been destroyed. Only he could bring it back. Hoban returned to the site and assessed the damage. the news was mixed. The exterior walls had survived. This was crucial. The stone shell that had taken years to build still stood. The interior was completely destroyed. Every wooden element, every plaster wall, every floor and ceiling and staircase, gone. But with the walls intact, reconstruction could proceed faster than original construction. The shell provided the framework. Workers would rebuild the interior within that shell. Essentially, they would construct a new building inside the remains of the old one. Funding came through Congress. The amounts were substantial, but less than building entirely new would have cost. The surviving walls saved money. They saved time. They saved the project. Work began in 1815. Workers cleared debris from the interior, tons of charred wood and fallen plaster. The burned smell lingered for months, but slowly the shell was emptied. The foundation was exposed and inspected. The walls were examined for structural integrity. Some stone needed replacement. The fire had damaged sections beyond repair. New blocks were quarried at Aquia Creek, 40 miles away, the same quarry that had supplied the original construction. The new stone had to match the old: color, texture, quality. Workers at the quarry selected carefully. The interior reconstruction followed the same basic plan as the original. Hoban's design would be preserved. The rooms would occupy the same positions. The proportions would remain, but improvements could be incorporated. Problems with the original building could be corrected. The framing went up floor by floor. Wooden beams and joists, timber cut from regional forests. Carpenters assembled the framework with skill developed through years of practice. The building took shape inside its stone shell. Plastering followed framing, walls and ceilings. Decorative elements in the principal rooms. Skilled plasterers worked for months creating the elaborate moldings and ceiling designs that would give the formal rooms their character. The work proceeded through 1815, through 1816, into 1817. Steady progress, but no rushing. The building had to be done right. Poor workmanship would create problems that would last for decades. And then came the paint. The exterior walls still showed damage, smoke staining, discoloration from heat. The elegant sandstone that Hoban had specified looked scarred and burned. Something had to be done. Whitewashing stone buildings was common in that era. The treatment protected stone from weather. It created uniform appearance. It covered imperfections. The decision to paint the president's house white was practical, expedient. The white paint would hide the fire damage. Workers applied the white paint during reconstruction, coat after coat, covering the blackened stone, covering the history of destruction, creating something new from something burned. The transformation was remarkable. The building that had been natural sandstone, then burned stone, became white, bright white against the Washington sky, a symbol of renewal, of defiance, of survival. People noticed. They had always called it the President's House, or the Executive Mansion. Now they started calling it something else, a descriptive term. Obvious, inevitable, the White House. The name appeared in newspapers, in correspondence, in common speech. The building was white. It was a house, the White House. No one declared it officially. No one made a proclamation. The name simply emerged from what the building had become. President James Monroe moved in during November 1817, almost exactly 17 years after John Adams had first occupied the original building. The White House was ready again. Different, new inside old walls, but ready. Monroe found a building that looked familiar from outside. The same proportions, the same facade, the same white paint covering everything. Inside, everything was new. New floors, new walls, new ceilings. The rooms were the same sizes in the same positions, but nothing remained from before the fire except the stone shell. The portrait of George Washington returned. Dolly Madison had saved it. The painting hung again in the state dining room, where it had hung before British officers ate dinner and set the building ablaze. The portrait had survived. The building had survived. The nation had survived. For the first time since the burning, the White House felt like a presidential home. The years that followed brought continuous change. Each president modified something. Each administration left marks. The building evolved while maintaining its basic character. The porticos came in the 1820s, the North Portico in 1829, the South Portico earlier in 1824. These covered entrance structures transformed the building's appearance. They gave the White House its iconic look. The columns and pediments that tourists photograph today were not part of Hoban's original design. They were added decades later. Technology arrived gradually. Each advancement changed how the building worked. Gas lighting came in 1848. President Polk authorized the installation. Gas jets replaced candles in many rooms. The light was brighter, more consistent, but it also brought risks. Gas could leak. Open flames could start fires. The building that had burned once could burn again. Running water improved throughout the decades. Indoor plumbing expanded from Jefferson's early efforts. Hot and cold water, multiple bathrooms. The improvements made the building more comfortable, more sanitary, more modern. Central heating was attempted with mixed success. The massive rooms were difficult to warm. Early heating systems struggled. Fireplaces remained essential supplements well into the 20th century. The telegraph arrived during the Civil War. President Lincoln used telegraph communications constantly. Reports from battlefields, orders to generals. For the first time, a president could communicate with distant armies in something approaching real time. The technology transformed command and control. Telephones came in 1877 under President Hayes. The first phone was installed in the telegraph room. A curiosity at first, essential within years. Electric lighting arrived in 1891. President Harrison and his wife were reportedly terrified of the new technology. They sometimes left lights burning all night rather than touch the switches. The fear was not unreasonable. Early electrical systems were dangerous. Wires could short. Fires could start. But electric light was cleaner and safer than gas. It represented the future. Each technological advancement required modifications. Wiring installed. Plumbing expanded. Heating systems improved. The 18th century building was being continuously adapted for 19th and 20th century life. But the building also witnessed tragedy. The White House was home to presidents and their families. It was where they celebrated, where they mourned, where they suffered. Willie Lincoln died in the White House in February 1862. He was 11 years old, bright and beloved. The son who most resembled his father in temperament and intellect. He had fallen ill weeks earlier. Typhoid fever, probably, contracted from the contaminated water that still plagued the city. Lincoln was managing a war, the greatest crisis in American history. Hundreds of thousands of men under arms, the nation tearing itself apart. He could not stop working. He could not stop trying to save the country, but his son was dying upstairs. Willie died on a Thursday afternoon. Lincoln walked into his secretary's office. "My boy is gone," he said. "He is actually gone." Mary Todd Lincoln collapsed. She was confined to her bed for weeks. She held seances in the White House, trying to contact Willie's spirit. She never fully recovered. The loss broke something in her that could not be mended. Lincoln himself carried the weight. Those who saw him noted the change. The lines in his face deepened. The sadness in his eyes grew. He continued working. He had no choice, but he was not the same man. Willie's body lay in state in the green room. Then he was buried. The White House, that symbol of power and democracy, had become a house of mourning. one boy among hundreds of thousands who would die before the war ended. Lincoln himself would not survive much longer. April 14, 1865, Good Friday. 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the war was essentially over. Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to see a play. He never came home. John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning in a boarding house across the street from the theater. He never regained consciousness. He never returned to the White House. His body did return. It lay in state in the East Room, that grand space where Abigail Adams had once hung laundry. Thousands filed past to pay respects. The building was draped in black. The White House that had witnessed so much history witnessed the death of the man who had saved the nation. Other presidents died in office during the century. William Henry Harrison served just 31 days before dying of pneumonia in 1841. Zachary Taylor died in 1850 after eating contaminated food at a July 4th celebration. James Garfield was shot in 1881 and lingered for months before dying. William McKinley was shot in 1901. The White House accumulated these histories: triumph and tragedy, policy decisions and personal losses. The building witnessed everything, contained everything. The walls that enslaved workers had helped build, that British soldiers had tried to burn, those walls heard the cries of grieving mothers and the laughter of children at play. They witnessed history being made and lives being destroyed. By the late 1800s, the building was showing its age. Decades of continuous occupation had taken their toll. The structure that Hoban had rebuilt after the fire needed maintenance, needed updating, needed renovation. Theodore Roosevelt discovered just how badly when he moved in 1901. The White House was falling apart, floors sagged, walls cracked. The building was literally dangerous. Structural engineers warned that portions could collapse. The president's family was living in a building that might kill them. Roosevelt authorized a massive renovation in 1902. The state floor was completely rebuilt. The West Wing was constructed to move executive offices out of the residence. For the first time, the president would have a dedicated workspace, separate from where his family lived. The renovation addressed immediate structural problems. It modernized systems. It preserved historical character while making the building functional for the 20th century. Roosevelt also made the name official. Previous presidents had used various terms: President's House, Executive Mansion. Roosevelt put the White House on official stationery, on government communications, on everything. The informal name that had emerged after the 1814 fire became the official designation, 87 years after the building was first painted white. But the 1902 renovation was not enough. The problems went deeper than anyone realized. The White House was fundamentally unsound. It would take another president, another crisis, to reveal just how bad things had become. The debate over rebuilding consumed Washington for weeks. Congress met in temporary quarters. The Patent Office building had survived the fire. It was one of the few government structures still standing. Representatives and senators crowded into rooms never designed for legislative business. They argued about the future. Move to Philadelphia, some said. The arguments were practical. Philadelphia had buildings, infrastructure, everything a capital needed. Why spend years and fortunes rebuilding what the British had destroyed? Why prove that America would keep throwing money at a swamp? Others disagreed. Moving would be surrender. The British wanted to humiliate America. Giving up the capital would complete that humiliation. The nation's pride demanded rebuilding, even if it was expensive, even if it was difficult, even if it took years. The votes were close. Closer than history usually remembers. The decision to rebuild Washington was not unanimous. It was not obvious. It was a choice made by a slim majority who believed that symbols mattered as much as practicality. Once the decision was made, the work began. James Hoban returned to the site in early 1815. He had not gone far. Washington was his home now. He had built a career in the city he had helped create. Now he would recreate his most famous building. He walked through the burned shell of the president's house. The stone walls rose around him, empty and blackened. The sky was visible where the roof had been. Debris covered what had been floors, charred wood, broken plaster, the remnants of everything that had burned. But the walls were sound. Hoban examined them carefully. He looked for cracks, for structural damage, for any sign that the fire had compromised the stone. There was damage, certainly. Some sections would need repair or replacement, but the basic structure remained solid. This was the key. The walls provided a framework. Workers would not have to start from nothing. They would rebuild the interior within the existing shell, faster than original construction, cheaper than building new. Hoban drew up plans. The basic design would remain the same. The rooms would occupy the same positions. The proportions would be preserved. But improvements could be made. Problems with the original building could be corrected. Funding came from Congress. The appropriations were generous by the standards of the time. The political will to rebuild translated into money. Workers could be hired, materials could be purchased, construction could begin. The clearing took weeks. Everything inside the walls had to be removed, tons of debris. Charred timbers that had been floors and ceilings, collapsed sections of interior walls. Workers hauled it out bucket by bucket, wagon by wagon. As they cleared, they uncovered what had survived. The foundations remained solid. The basement level had been protected by stone. Some sections were salvageable, others needed repair. New stone came from Aquia Creek, the same quarry that had supplied the original construction, the same type of sandstone. Workers selected blocks that matched the color and texture of the original stone. Repairs needed to blend seamlessly. Stonemasons replaced damaged sections. They removed cracked blocks and fitted new ones. They matched the coursing patterns of the original work. When they finished, the repairs were nearly invisible. The interior framing began in late 1815. Carpenters built the wooden structure that would divide the shell into rooms, floors, walls, ceilings, the skeleton of a building within the stone skeleton that remained. The lumber came from regional forests. Quality timber, carefully selected. The wood had to be properly seasoned. Green lumber would warp and crack as it dried. The framing had to be built to last. Workers raised beams and joists. They nailed and pegged the framework together. Floor by floor, the building took shape. The empty shell became enclosed spaces. Rooms emerged where there had been nothing. Plastering followed framing. The same process as before. Wet plaster applied to wooden lath. Smoothed and shaped, layer after layer until the surfaces were perfect. The principal rooms received elaborate treatment. The state dining room. The East Room. The spaces where presidents would receive guests and conduct the ceremonial business of the nation. Plasterers created decorative elements that would impress visitors. Painting came next. The walls, the moldings, the ceilings. Each room received its colors. The decorative schemes varied by room, creating distinct atmospheres for different purposes. And outside, the white paint. The exterior walls still showed fire damage, the smoke staining, the discoloration from extreme heat. The natural sandstone color was gone. Something had to cover it. White paint was the practical choice. It hid the damage. It created uniform appearance. It protected the stone from further weathering. Workers applied coat after coat until the walls gleamed. The transformation was remarkable. The building that had stood burned and blackened now stood bright white, a symbol of renewal, of survival, of defiance. The work continued through 1816 and into 1817, steady progress, no shortcuts. The building had to be right. By late 1817, the president's house was ready for occupancy. President Monroe moved in that November. The building was not perfect. Some finishing work continued for months, but it was functional. A president could live and work there. The name White House emerged naturally from what the building had become. A White House? The White House? The informal term spread through conversation and correspondence. Newspapers used it. Letters mentioned it. The name stuck because it was obvious. The building that rose from reconstruction looked much like the building that had burned. The same proportions, the same facade, the same relationship to the landscape. Hoban had preserved his original vision while creating essentially a new structure. But nothing remained of the original interior. Nothing remained of the work that enslaved people and free people had done together in the 1790s. The fire had erased it. The reconstruction had replaced it. Only the exterior walls, those massive stone walls, connected the new building to what had been built before. Those walls would endure through decades of presidential occupancy, through renovations and modifications, through another complete reconstruction a century later. The walls built in the 1790s, damaged in 1814, repaired in 1815, still stand today. The 19th century brought continuous change. The White House under Monroe was simple by later standards, elegant but not ostentatious. The new president worked to furnish the rebuilt building appropriately. He ordered furniture from France. Artisans created pieces specifically for the mansion. The White House began to look presidential. The porticos added in the 1820s transformed the building's appearance. Columns and pediments on north and south, the features that define the White House image today. Visitors saw a different building after the porticos went up. More classical, more impressive, more iconic. Andrew Jackson brought a different style. Old Hickory was not a polished aristocrat. He opened the White House to ordinary citizens in ways previous presidents had not. His inaugural reception became a legendary disaster. Crowds packed the building. Windows were broken. Furniture was damaged. Jackson himself had to escape through a window. The building survived Jackson. It survived presidents who followed. Each administration made changes, some major, some minor. The building evolved continuously. Running water improved, gas lighting arrived. Modern conveniences that previous generations could not have imagined became standard features. The White House adapted to new technologies as they developed. The Civil War transformed the building's meaning. Lincoln used the White House as command center. The weight of the war pressed down on everything. Casualty reports arrived constantly. Strategic decisions had to be made. The president worked late into every night, managing the conflict that would determine the nation's survival. The building witnessed his grief, Willie's death, the impossible burden of leading a nation at war while mourning a child. Lincoln walked the halls of the White House carrying weight that would have crushed most men, and the building witnessed the aftermath of his assassination. The black bunting draped everywhere. The thousands who filed past his coffin in the East Room. The mourning of a nation for the man who had saved it. The White House accumulated these histories. Each president added to them. Each administration left traces. The building became a repository of American memory. By 1900, the building needed help. Theodore Roosevelt found a structure that was beautiful and dangerous. The floors sagged, the walls cracked. Engineers warned that portions could collapse. The White House was failing. The 1902 renovation addressed immediate problems. The West Wing was built to move offices out of the residence. The state floor was rebuilt. Systems were modernized. The building was made safe again, but the fundamental problems remained. The structure was old. The materials were aging. Each renovation addressed symptoms without curing the disease. Taft expanded the West Wing. Wilson added the Rose Garden. Coolidge modified the roof. Hoover renovated throughout. Each president did something. The building kept changing. Then came Truman. The bathroom floor incident was just the beginning. Engineers discovered that the entire building was compromised. The wooden structure that Hoban had built in 1817 was failing throughout, not just in one room, everywhere. The White House was not safe to occupy. Truman faced the same choice that Madison had faced in 1814: rebuild or abandon. He chose rebuilding. The gutting was total. Everything inside the stone walls came out. Every piece of wood, every section of plaster, every system. The building was emptied to its shell. For the second time in its history, the White House was reduced to exterior walls surrounding empty space. The same walls that had survived British fire, still standing. The steel frame changed everything. Modern engineering inserted inside the historic shell. The new structure would carry all the weight. The old walls would be preserved, but no longer structural. The reconstruction took 4 years. When Truman moved back in, the White House looked the same from outside. Inside, everything was new. Every floor, every wall, every room. The building that exists today dates mostly to that reconstruction. The 1949-1952 project created the modern White House. The exterior walls are older. The porticos are 19th century. Everything else is mid-20th century construction inside an 18th century shell. But the continuity matters. The same site, the same footprint, the same proportions, the same walls. The building connects present to past, even though almost nothing original survives inside. The workers who built those walls in the 1790s could not have imagined what their work would become. They quarried stone and shaped it. They hauled it 40 miles and lifted it into place. They built something that would outlast everyone alive at the time: free workers and enslaved workers together. Their labor made permanent, their lives mostly forgotten. But the walls remain. The White House has stood for over 2 centuries. It has witnessed everything America has been through: the triumphs, the tragedies, the compromises, the contradictions. It began as a political deal, a bargain over dinner. Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison trading debt for location. The building exists because of that bargain. It was designed by an Irish immigrant. James Hoban brought his training to American shores. He won a competition. He spent years supervising construction. His vision shaped what the building became. It was built by diverse workers, skilled craftsmen from Europe, immigrants seeking opportunity, enslaved people who had no choice, all of them together, building the same walls. It was burned by the British, destroyed in a single night, everything except the walls reduced to ash. It was rebuilt through determination. The choice to stay rather than retreat. The walls providing framework for reconstruction, the white paint covering the scars. It has been home to 46 presidents. Each one walking the same halls, looking out the same windows, living within the same walls. It has witnessed history being made, wars declared, peace achieved, legislation signed, crises managed, the daily work of governing a nation. And it has witnessed personal lives, children born, families raised, deaths mourned. The presidents were not just presidents, they were people. The White House was not just office, it was home. The building contains all of this: the politics and the personal, the public and the private, the history of a nation and the lives of individuals. The stones quarried at Aquia Creek contain it all. The walls built in the 1790s, the walls that have been painted white so many times that the paint is now part of them. The walls that have stood through fire and reconstruction and centuries of change. They will continue standing. They will witness whatever comes next. They will contain the history that has not yet happened. The White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, built by many hands, destroyed by fire, rebuilt in defiance, standing still. This is its story. This is their story. The story of everyone who built it. Harry Truman was standing in his bathroom when the floor started to shake. It was 1948, 3 years into his presidency. He was getting ready for a formal reception. The bathtub began vibrating. The walls trembled. Truman thought it was an earthquake or a bomb. It was the White House itself, failing. Engineers were called. They conducted a thorough inspection. What they found was terrifying. The building was on the verge of collapse. The original structure dated to the 1790s. The reconstruction after the fire dated to 1817. The Roosevelt renovation had addressed some problems, but not the fundamental issues. For over a century, the White House had been slowly deteriorating from the inside. The wooden interior structure was giving way. Beams that had supported the building for decades were rotting, sagging, breaking. The floors in some rooms were so weak that they could collapse under the weight of a crowd. The chandeliers in the East Room weighed nearly a ton each. Engineers calculated that the ceiling could not hold them much longer. A leg of Margaret Truman's piano had actually broken through the floor, just punched right through. The president's daughter was playing, and her piano started falling through the building. The White House was not just in bad shape. It was dangerous. The president and his family were living in a structure that could come down around them at any moment. Truman moved across the street to Blair House, the presidential guest residence. His family joined him. The White House was emptied of occupants for the first time since the British burned it. Then the demolition began. Workers gutted the interior completely. Not renovation this time, removal. Everything inside the exterior walls came out. Floors, ceilings, walls, staircases. The entire internal structure was demolished and hauled away. Only the exterior walls remained. The same walls that had survived the 1814 fire. Hobon's walls. The walls that free workers and enslaved workers had built together in the 1790s. Those walls and nothing else. A new steel frame was constructed inside the shell. Modern engineering, modern materials, modern structural support. The steel frame would carry the weight of the building. The old walls would be preserved, but no longer load-bearing. New foundations were poured, deeper, stronger. The building had been settling unevenly for over a century. The new foundations would stabilize it. Then workers rebuilt the interior, again. For the third time in the building's history, the reconstruction took nearly 4 years, 1949 to 1952, the most comprehensive project since Hobon's rebuilding after the fire. When it was done, the White House looked the same from outside. The same white walls, the same porticos, the same windows. Inside, everything was new. Every floor, every wall, every ceiling, every system. The rooms were recreated to look like they had before. Decorative elements were restored or reproduced. But nothing remained of the original interior. Nothing remained of Hobon's 1817 reconstruction. The White House that Truman returned to in 1952 was essentially a new building inside old walls. Those walls told the story. The stones quarried at Aquia Creek in the 1790s. Shaped by workers whose names were mostly lost, hauled 40 miles by wagon and barge, laid course by course over 8 years, burned by the British in 1814, painted white to hide the scars, standing still. The same stones that had witnessed John Adams' first night, Jefferson's improvements, Dolly Madison's rescue of Washington's portrait, Lincoln's grief for Willie, Theodore Roosevelt's discovery that the building was failing, Truman's discovery that it was worse than anyone thought. The stones remained. Everything else changed around them. And what about the people who built those walls, the workers whose labor made the White House possible? For 200 years, no one talked about them much. The history focused on presidents, on architects, on the building's role in American governance. The workers were invisible, the enslaved workers especially. This began changing in the late 20th century. Historians started examining the records more carefully. The payment ledgers at the National Archives, the documents that showed slave owners being paid for workers' labor, the scattered references that sometimes, occasionally, mentioned an enslaved worker by name. The White House Historical Association sponsored research. Scholars cross-referenced documents. They searched for any trace of the people who had actually built the building. The work was painstaking. Most records listed owners, not workers, property, not people, but some names emerged. Historical research has identified certain enslaved individuals who worked on the White House. First names mostly, sometimes occupations. Carpenters, masons, laborers, the specific work they performed. These names represent only a fraction of the enslaved workers who contributed, but each name recovered is an individual whose story can begin to be told. The acknowledgement has expanded. Tours of the White House now mention that enslaved workers helped build it. Educational materials address the topic. Historical markers have been placed. In 2016, First Lady Michelle Obama spoke at the Democratic National Convention. She talked about living in the White House with her family. She talked about watching her daughters play on the South Lawn. Then she said something that resonated across the country. "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." The statement was historically accurate. It was also uncomfortable. The White House represents American democracy, American freedom, American ideals. The fact that enslaved people helped build it creates tension. The building embodies both the nation's aspirations and its failures. The contradiction cannot be resolved. It can only be acknowledged. The White House exists because of the labor of many people. Free craftsmen who earned wages, immigrants seeking opportunity, and enslaved workers who had no choice, who received no compensation, whose names were not considered worth recording. They all built the White House. The building stands because of all of them. Today, the White House functions as it always has, and differently than it ever has. The president lives and works in the building. The residence occupies the second and third floors. The Oval Office in the West Wing is where executive business occurs. The building that John Adams found cold and incomplete now serves as command center for a global superpower. Technology has transformed everything. Communication systems that Lincoln could not have imagined. Security measures that Roosevelt never faced. The building is monitored constantly, protected constantly. The open house that Jefferson championed has become a fortress. Over 1 million visitors tour the White House in normal years. They walk through rooms where history happened. The East Room, where Lincoln lay in state. The State Dining Room, where British officers ate dinner before burning the building. The spaces that enslaved workers helped create. 46 presidents have lived in the White House, from Adams, who stayed 4 months, to those who served full terms. Some transformed the nation. Some were transformed by it. All of them walked the same halls, slept in the same building, looked out the same windows. The White House has witnessed inaugurations and assassinations, wars declared and peace treaties signed, personal triumphs and family tragedies, children born and presidents died. The building contains American history in concentrated form. The physical structure connects present to past. The exterior walls include stones from the 1790s, stones that survived fire and reconstruction. The building provides continuity across more than 2 centuries of American governance. But the White House also evolves. Every president modifies something. Technology advances. Security requirements change. The building adapts to meet each era's needs while maintaining connection to its origins. The Roosevelt renovation, the Truman reconstruction, countless smaller changes. The building that Hoban designed has been transformed by every generation. Each left marks while respecting what came before. The White House will continue changing. Future presidents will make modifications. New technologies will require new systems. The building will adapt as it always has, but the walls will remain. The stones that workers quarried and cut and hauled and stacked over 200 years ago. The walls that survived British fire and American Reconstruction, that have been painted white so many times that the paint is now part of them. Those walls tell the story, not just of presidents or politics, of workers, of labor, of the people whose hands shaped the stones, free and enslaved, named and anonymous, remembered and forgotten. The White House stands because they built it. The building is their legacy as much as any president's. Understanding the full history means understanding all of them. This has been the untold story of the White House, not just where presidents live, how the building came to be, the political bargain that placed the Capitol in a swamp, Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison around a dinner table, trading debt for location, the Irish architect who won a competition and spent years making his vision real, James Hoban, supervising construction, then reconstruction, creating the building twice. The workers who actually built it, Scottish stone cutters and Irish laborers, immigrants seeking opportunity, enslaved people who had no choice, all of them, free and unfree, shaping the same stones. The fire that destroyed everything except the walls. British soldiers eating dinner before setting the blaze. Dolly Madison, saving Washington's portrait. The decision to rebuild rather than retreat. The white paint that covered burn scars and gave the building its name. A practical choice that became permanent identity. The building's evolution through 2 centuries. Technology arriving. Tragedies occurring. Reconstruction after reconstruction. The modern acknowledgement of all who built it. The names being recovered, the history being completed. The White House has stood at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue for over 200 years. It has witnessed American history unfold. It has been the stage for triumph and tragedy, home to leaders and their families, symbol of democracy to the world. But before all of that, it was a construction site. Workers quarried stone and cut it to size. They laid foundations and raised walls. They framed rooms and finished surfaces, free and enslaved, paid and unpaid, named and anonymous. They built the White House. This is their story too.